Hi, boys and girls. It's Mr. Wasemann, and once again, we are in our Geography Skills section of our Pearson My World Indiana History text. We're on pages IN 36 and 37, and we're going to start by talking about this concept of longitude and latitude lines. Now, in previous tutorials, we've talked about how we use grids on maps to help us locate places relative to one another. Now, grids are horizontal and vertical lines that help create like a graph paper system of coordinates. Longitude and latitude lines work similar to those, except when you think about our Earth, which is a three-dimensional sphere, a big old ball, it's not a flat surface. There are curves and arcs that don't allow for 90-degree angles. So as you can see at the top of page 36, we've got a model of the Earth, and it shows us these longitude lines. Now, longitude lines originate either at the North Pole or the South Pole, and as you can see right here, all the lines seem to start from the pole, and they kind of widen out as they go towards the center or the equator, kind of like a beach ball or maybe a basketball. These lines seem close together, but then they widen as you get out towards the center, and that's because the Earth is a sphere. Now, as you go from the point of the equator down toward the South Pole, these longitude lines tend to converge again at a point at the bottom. Now, just like the prime meridian and the equator that we discussed in previous lessons, these lines are imaginary. They don't physically exist on the surface of our planet. However, we use these in maps to help us figure out the relative position of one place versus another. Now, when you read in the text, it says one set of lines runs from the North Pole to the South Pole. These lines of longitude, and the prime meridian is labeled 0 degrees longitude. Lines of longitude are labeled from 0 to 180 degrees. Lines east of the prime meridian are labeled with an E, and lines west of it are labeled with a W. So if you look at our diagram again, the prime meridian is this line. Kind of cuts through parts of northern Africa and parts of Europe, and this is just the starting point. It's an arbitrary position on our planet, but that's where they decided to draw the longitude lines hundreds of years ago. And if you are west of this line on the planet, longitude lines will be labeled with a degree mark and then followed by a W for west. If you live east of this line, of course, same applies. You'll go in an easterly direction, and that longitude degree will be marked with an E. Now, we also have a system that shows us a position called latitude. Okay, and latitude is based off of the equator. The equator is the middle of the Earth from a horizontal line perspective. It says halfway between the poles, the equator circles the globe. The line is 0 degrees latitude. Lines north of the equator are labeled with an N. Lines south of the equator are labeled with an S, so north and south. Same as the longitude lines. The only difference here is that we only divide the Earth in terms of latitude lines up to 90 degrees. So again, here's my equator. Again, that is an imaginary line. That imaginary line divides our world in half. We talked about hemispheres earlier on, so half a sphere is a hemisphere. And if you go north of the equator, the degree marks for latitude are going to be labeled with an N. If you go south of the equator, the same is true with an S. Okay? The North Pole and the South Pole are the 90-degree points, north or south, when it comes to latitude lines. So these grids of lines cut across our planet and help us figure out where things are. Now, Indiana is part of our planet, And of course, it is labeled with some lines of latitude. So here's a picture I just snagged off the internet. And as you can see, our longitude lines and latitude lines create a grid across our state. Now, it's not a square grid like we saw in previous tutorials, and you're going to notice that there is a ever so slight arc to the lines. They're not 100% straight. I mean, to the naked eye, very much so it looks straight, but they kind of curve ever so slightly. And what you're going to notice is that Indiana falls between roughly 85 and 88 degrees west longitude. A little bit is in the 84 range. And in terms of latitude, we fall between 42 and 38 degrees latitude north. Okay? So again, if you wanted to figure out the exact coordinates of a place on the Earth, you could use longitude and latitude lines. Pilots and people who are in airplanes or use satellites will use longitude and latitude lines to help them find things from the air. The same is true if you are a sailor and on the open sea where there are no physical boundaries to figure out where you are. These folks use longitude and latitude lines to help mark position. So these grid lines work just like a flat grid on a map. It's just that the longitude and latitude lines arc with the curve of our sphere that is Earth. Now then, let me go to page 37, which shows us something completely different. Okay? Maps, more often than not, are for looking at where things are. But once in a while, a map will show us when something happened relative to the location on the planet. Now, as you can see, as it starts to pixelate, this is a map of North America, and it has many of the tools that a map uses, like the compass rose up here in the top corner in the Canadian section. It's got a map scale to give us perspective of how big of a place we're looking at. But you're going to notice these lines that kind of cut across the country, mainly through the United States, and these lines aren't rivers or roads or political borders, but they show a sequence of events. North America was unknown to European and African people hundreds of years ago, but over time, people started to venture across the ocean and landed on what they called the New World. And these folks wanted to report back to their superiors what they found. And this led to the expansion and the colonization of North and then later South America. Many of these explorers took different routes. So, for example, if I were, say, Robert LaSalle was one of the folks that helped explore Indiana. You'll notice that on the map, his pathway is marked with a red line. And Robert LaSalle started right here on his journey to explore. He traveled across the Midwest, starting with areas of New York. And you'll notice that he kind of went along the Great Lakes region. That was because hundreds of years ago, there were no cars, there were no airplanes. You had two ways of travel. You either hoofed it, literally and figuratively. You either were walking it using your own feet, or you were in some sort of vehicle that was pulled by someone else's feet, like oxes or horses. The other way to travel was by boat, and that was the more common way to travel across large distances hundreds of years ago because it was a lot faster. You would flow along with the course of the river, or you would use sails, or you would use oars to push yourself along the water. And LaSalle traveled and explored up to the point where the water ran out. And then in here, you'll see that he landed and had to start walking instead of using boats in many places. Some places he was able to carry his boats from one place to another, and they call that portaging. Okay, there's an actual city in Indiana called Portage, Indiana, and that is where Robert LaSalle had to stop, get out of the water, and he and his crew had to carry their canoes to another place where they could get back into the water. So these arrows, these lines, show us not a position on a map or an actual place, but they describe a path that these explorers took back in the day when they were exploring the United States. So that map, that key right up here, isn't showing us physical locations. They're showing us kind of a window into history. Okay? So when you're looking at maps and when you're thinking about what information that they're telling us, usually it's about where. But once in a while, a map will be paired with some historical text, a story about what happened in the past, and the map will try to illustrate to you what happened, where, and then what happened when. So your task for today, friends, is to read the text on pages Indiana 36 and 37. As you're reading, I want you to either answer the embedded questions or complete the embedded tasks that are on these 2 pages. If you have questions or need help with this activity, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will talk again soon. Thank you.